I still remember that early morning as if it were yesterday. The clock struck just before 3, and the whole house was plunged into absolute silence. Fresno has always been quiet at night, the kind of town where the loudest sound you hear is the crickets chirping outside. I was fast asleep, and John, as always, was snoring softly beside me. But something that night was different. A strange feeling, almost as if the air had become heavy, difficult to breathe. Lucky, our cat, started acting in a way we'd never seen before. First came the sound of his footsteps running back and forth. Then, the meows, short, high-pitched, insistent. He jumped on the bed, scratched the sheets, and looked at me with those wide eyes, full of something I would only understand later, fear. And when he started pulling at the edge of the blanket with his teeth, it was impossible to ignore. Before continuing, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, because we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, because His love is eternal and infinite. I also take this opportunity to ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. At that moment, I didn't know that our lives were about to change forever. I had no idea that, in less than 5 minutes, everything we had built in over 40 years of marriage would be put to the test. But what no one knew was that Lucky, yes, that little gray cat we adopted on a rainy afternoon, would be the instrument God used to save us. And that's why today, whenever someone asks me if I believe in miracles, I smile and say, yes. Because I experienced one. That week had started like any other. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, painting the flowered curtains I'd sewn years ago with gold. John read the newspaper with his black coffee, and the radio played an old Frank Sinatra song softly. Everything seemed normal, calm, predictable, and perhaps that was exactly what made that day so dangerous, the false sense of routine. Lucky slept curled up near the fireplace, completely oblivious to the world. He had always been calm, almost lazy, a cat who loved to nap and eat sardines. Sometimes, I would jokingly say that he looked like an old man with a white mustache, with his deep and wise gaze. I never would have imagined that that gaze held something beyond sweetness. It held a premonition. It was March, and Fresno was experiencing one of those winters that just refused to leave. The nights were still cold, and the damp ground left a strong earthy smell. I remember that, on that Sunday, I spent a good part of the afternoon tidying the garden and gathering dry leaves. Lucky followed me closely, as if watching my every step. And, as much as I laughed at it, there was something about his behavior that made me a little uneasy. John, on the other hand, found it amusing. "You and that cat have a strange connection," he'd say, laughing, while adjusting the radio. I'd just reply that animals sense things we don't. And, in a way, I was right. Lucky seemed to notice subtle changes, the weather, the mood of the house, even the arguments we tried to hide. He always knew when something bad was about to happen. That night, the sky was clear. One of those starry skies that makes you thank God for being alive. I said my prayer before bed, asking only for health and peace. Lucky jumped onto the bed soon after, snuggling between us. I stroked his soft fur and closed my eyes, feeling that familiar warmth. Little did I know that this simple gesture would be the last moment of peace before chaos. Around 2:45, I woke up to a strange sound, a slight crack coming from the wall. I opened my eyes, still half asleep, and realized Lucky wasn't there anymore. I called his name, but he didn't answer. The crack repeated itself. And, for a second, I thought it was just the wind hitting the window. But the wind doesn't meow, much less scratch at the door with such force. I got up slowly, trying not to wake John, and walked to the hallway. The living room clock read 2:50. Lucky was standing in front of the front door, his tail bristled, his ears perked up. He was staring intently at something I couldn't see. As I approached, he let out a long meow, almost a scream. And that's when my heart started racing. I opened the door, thinking maybe he wanted to leave. But he didn't move. He just looked at me, then at the ceiling, as if trying to warn me about something. I swear I felt a strange presence in that house. A tense, heavy silence, like before a storm. It was at that moment that John appeared, rubbing his eyes and asking what was happening. "It's Lucky. He's agitated," I replied, trying to hide my fear. John shrugged, somewhat impatiently, and went back to the room. But the cat wouldn't stop. He jumped, meowed, circled around me. I began to feel something different from anything I had ever felt before, a kind of intuition that burned in my chest. When the clock struck 2:55, Lucky ran to the bedroom and jumped back onto the bed. He scratched the sheets, tried to pull John by his clothes, and meowed as if screaming. John got up, a little annoyed, thinking the cat wanted food. But no. Lucky ran back into the hallway, looked at us, and gave another sharp meow. That's when I realized he wanted to get us out of there. He seemed desperate for us to leave the house. And, even without understanding why, I decided to follow him. He ran to the kitchen, then to the back door. The clock read 2:57. I felt a chill down my spine, an inexplicable sensation, and I followed my instincts. As John put on his slippers, Lucky was already outside, staring at us with his fur standing on end. It was then that I heard a dull sound, coming from the depths of the earth. A sound I will never forget. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, and a mug fell from the shelf. John looked at me, startled. I didn't need to say anything. Lucky meowed once more, and the world, literally, began to tremble. But this is a part of the story you need to listen to carefully. Because what happened next was something that even the news couldn't fully explain. In the days leading up to that early morning, Lucky had been acting in a way that intrigued me. He, who always slept curled up near the heater, began to prefer the cold kitchen floor. Sometimes he would spend hours staring intently at the wall, as if he were listening to something we couldn't hear. John said it was all in my head, but something inside me told me it wasn't. On the Wednesday before the earthquake, I noticed he refused his food. Lucky never did that. I put his bowl of salmon, his favorite, and he simply walked away. He stood near the window, alert, his tail wagging slowly. "Are you sick, my love?" I asked, kneeling down to look into his eyes. But there was no sickness there. There was fear. That night, while I was washing the dishes, he started meowing, staring at the turned-off stove. Long, sad meows that echoed through the house. I was so disturbed that I turned off the radio. Everything went silent, just me and that sound that seemed like a warning. A shiver ran down my spine. It was as if the very air in the house was vibrating. John came into the kitchen, saw the scene, and laughed. "Margaret, that cat needs a psychiatrist." I tried to laugh too, but I couldn't. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen on Lucky. I could swear that, somehow, he was trying to say something. And the scariest thing is that he only did it at night, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. On Thursday, the situation worsened. Lucky began scratching at the front door, desperate to get out. No matter how cold it was, he wanted to be outside. When I let him out, he ran into the yard and stared at the sky, fixed, motionless. The wind cut through the air, and the sound of the leaves mingled with his meowing. The scene was so strange that I found myself praying silently. "Lord, if something is happening, give me the wisdom to understand," I murmured. Lucky turned his head slowly, as if he had heard my prayer. And in that moment, I felt a brief but intense peace, as if God were saying, "Trust. I am here." Little did I know that this would be the last sign before the storm. On Friday, the city seemed different. Fresno had that still, stuffy air typical of days before rain. But the sky was clear, and that made me even more uneasy. At the market, people were talking about the strange weather. "Did you feel the ground shake yesterday?" a woman in the checkout line asked. I laughed nervously. No, I hadn't. But maybe Lucky had. When I got home, I found John chopping wood. Lucky was watching him, but from a distance, as if he didn't want to get close. When John raised the axe, the cat let out a sharp meow, startling him. The blade narrowly escaped. "That cat is going to give me a heart attack," he yelled. But inside, something told me that Lucky was protecting him from something worse. That night, while I was preparing dinner, Lucky stood under the table, staring at the ceiling. Seconds later, a small crack appeared in the wall near the door. John thought it was just the house working, as construction workers say. But Lucky's gaze, that look chilled me. He seemed to know that this was only the beginning. On Saturday, the signs became impossible to ignore. Lucky began avoiding the darker rooms, always sleeping near the back door. Sometimes he would wake up suddenly, his fur standing on end, and run to the yard. At night, he didn't want to stay inside at all. When we held him, he trembled, and looked at the ground, as if the ground itself frightened him. It was at that point that I started writing everything down in a notebook. The hours, the sounds, his behavior. I wanted to understand, but it was impossible. The cat that once symbolized tranquility now seemed like a restless messenger. And the strangest thing, every time he got agitated, the dishes trembled slightly on the shelf. Sunday dawned with a golden sun, too calm for what was to come. I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence. I made pancakes, turned on the radio, and opened the windows. Lucky climbed onto the windowsill and looked out at the horizon. The air was still. Not a single bird was singing. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. Suddenly, he let out a short meow, ran into the living room, and began scratching the carpet forcefully. He seemed to be trying to dig into the floor. I called John in a hurry. He came, looked, and just shook his head. "Maybe there's a mole down there," he joked. But I didn't laugh. Lucky looked at me and then at the ceiling again. That reminded me of the crackling noises I'd heard the night before. The afternoon dragged on, heavy. The sky began to change color, from blue to a strange orange hue. The leaves in the garden swayed without a wind. Lucky disappeared for a few minutes, and, when he returned, he was covered in dust. His eyes were more dilated than ever. It was the first time I thought about taking him to the vet, and perhaps I would have done it if it hadn't been too late. That night, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Lucky paced back and forth around the house. Every time he passed the bed, he let out a low, sad meow, like a lament. It was almost as if he knew what was about to happen and couldn't prevent it. I closed my eyes, held my rosary, and prayed for protection. God, protect our home. When the clock struck 2:50 that morning, he stopped in front of the door and looked at me. It was a look I will never forget. There was despair, but there was also love. Pure love. It was as if he was saying, "Wake up." Now. I got up, still half asleep, and followed him. He ran towards the kitchen, meowing incessantly. John grumbled, thinking he was hungry, but I knew he wasn't. Lucky never acted like that. When I got to the kitchen, he was standing on the sink, staring out the window. The glass was trembling slightly. The floor, too. "John, come see this," I yelled. He appeared, his face crumpled with sleep, but before he could say anything, Lucky jumped back to the floor and ran into the hallway. The vibration intensified. The lamps began to sway. I saw him stop in front of the back door and look at me one last time before meowing loudly, almost a scream. And it was in that instant that the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The clock struck 2:55, and the first deep crack echoed beneath the house. The ground shook. The windows vibrated. The walls creaked as if they were alive. John grabbed my shoulders and shouted something, but the sound was lost in the roar of the earth. Lucky shot out. I followed him without thinking. The wind cut my face, the ground swayed, and all I could do was run. We ran to the backyard seconds before the most terrifying noise of my life, the sound of something immense breaking apart. The house behind us began to crumble, and a cloud of dust enveloped us. And in the midst of that chaos, the only sound I could still distinguish was Lucky's desperate meow, echoing through the rubble. And that's when I understood. All those signs, all the strange behaviors, the sleepless nights, it all made sense now. Lucky knew. Somehow, he knew. But what I didn't know yet was the price we would pay for that divine warning. I can't say exactly what woke me up first that morning, the sound of the walls creaking, the rustling of the curtains, or Lucky's distressed meow. I only know that, in an instant, the world seemed to go off its axis. It felt like being in a dream, one of those dreams you want to wake up from but your body won't obey. When I opened my eyes, the room was still shrouded in twilight, and everything seemed, for a second, normal. But it wasn't. Lucky was running back and forth like a little gray lightning bolt. He climbed onto the bed, scratched the sheet, and then jumped to the floor, meowing desperately. John grumbled, turned to the other side, and tried to go back to sleep. I, however, felt my heart beat faster. There was something different about that commotion. Something urgent, almost sacred. I called his name softly. "Lucky, what's wrong, my love?" He stopped for a second, looked me in the eyes, and let out a sound that wasn't just a simple meow. It was a warning. At that moment, I got up. I walked to the window, pulled back the curtain, and realized that the sky was completely still. Not even the wind dared to blow. That's when I felt the first tremor. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the glass on the table wobble and fall to the floor. John woke up startled. "What was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I could only say, "I don't know," but Lucky knew. And before he could answer, another crack sounded, louder, closer. Lucky ran to the door, meowing loudly, and I understood. We needed to get out of there. I grabbed my coat, still not thinking straight. John looked at me confused, but followed my steps. Lucky was already standing in front of the back door, his fur standing on end and his backside erect, in a state I had never seen before. "Margaret, this is crazy, nothing's happening," he murmured. But the words had barely left his mouth when the floor vibrated again. This time, the tremor was accompanied by a dull roar. The sound came from below, as if something immense were moving in the depths of the earth. John's eyes widened. "My God!" he whispered. Lucky jumped out of the house, and, without hesitation, I followed. And it was at that exact moment that the kitchen clock fell off the wall, shattering on the floor. In the backyard, the air felt heavier, almost palpable. The trees moved even without wind. The silence was so dense that the cracking of the roof tiles sounded like thunder. John put his arm around my shoulders and said, "Maybe we should go outside." I nodded, but before we could take another step, the first big tremor began. The ground opened up beneath us. The sound was deafening, as if the whole world were screaming at once. The windows shattered, and the wooden gate came loose from the wall. I fell to my knees, feeling my heart pounding in rhythm with the earth's vibrations. John tried to pull me up, but dust was already beginning to engulf us. And Lucky disappeared from our sight. "John, Lucky!" I yelled, coughing through the dust. He tried to calm me down, but his own voice trembled. That's when a louder crash came, and part of the roof of the house collapsed onto the porch. The force of the impact made the ground shake even more. John grabbed my arm, and we ran, stumbling among the pieces of concrete and wood. In the midst of the chaos, I saw the living room bookcase collapse. The sound of falling objects mingled with the screams of people in neighboring houses. It was as if the whole world had woken up from a nightmare at the same time. "Let's go out into the street," John shouted. We ran. The gate, which had previously seemed too heavy, now swayed freely, creaking as if it were made of paper. As I crossed the gate, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, invisible waves that made me lose my balance. John held me tight. Behind us, the house began to collapse. The noise was deafening, the air thick with dust. And amidst it all, a familiar sound echoed, faint but clear, Lucky's meow. I turned my head, searching desperately. Nothing. Only dust. Only destruction. But that sound kept coming back, insistent, coming from somewhere among the rubble. "He's in there!" I screamed. John tried to hold me back, but the force of emotion was stronger. I broke free and started running back. "Margaret, no!" he shouted, but it was too late. I reached what remained of the room. Everything was covered in ash and debris. With each step, the floor creaked. The smell of gas and dust burned my throat. "Lucky!" I called again, my voice almost fading. And, in response, a small sound, a low moan, coming from under the old dining table. I knelt down and began to remove the pieces of wood. My heart was racing. Tears mingled with the dust on my face. Suddenly, a little paw appeared, trembling, covered in dust. "Oh, my God!" I murmured, my hands trembling. He was there. Alive. Lucky was alive. I hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. It was at that moment that I realized the ceiling of the room, the same one where John slept, had completely collapsed. If we had been there, we would have died. The cat, somehow, pulled us out seconds before the collapse. The weight of this revelation made me cry. I looked up, my eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for this four-legged angel. John appeared soon after, coughing, covered in dust. When he saw me hugging Lucky, he knelt beside me. He saved us, Margie. He really saved us. And in that instant, amidst the chaos, we both understood. None of it was a coincidence. Lucky was the instrument God used to wake us up in time. The rest of the night was a blur of sirens, screams, and weeping neighbors. The city lights had gone out. The ground still trembled slightly beneath our feet. Ambulances raced through the streets, and the sky was covered in smoke. I held Lucky as if holding on to my own life. He was breathing fast, but he was alive. The following hours seemed like an eternity. We were greeted by neighbors who still had parts of their houses standing. Lucky wouldn't leave my side. He slept in my lap, exhausted. I looked at him and thought about how a simple cat could feel something so powerful. Perhaps animals perceive what we, blinded by daily life, insist on ignoring, the whispers of creation. John tried to remain calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. If it weren't for Lucky, we'd be dead, Margie. I simply nodded. The tremor still echoed within me, not just in my body, but in my soul. I knew this would be the beginning of something much bigger. A calling, perhaps. At dawn, the sun rose weakly, timidly, as if afraid to shine on the wreckage. The city looked like a battlefield. Helicopters flew overhead, and the neighbor's radio trembled, saying, "Earthquake of magnitude 7.0. Fresno in a state of emergency." I looked at Lucky, who was still lying in my lap, and murmured, "You knew, didn't you? God used you to save us." He slowly opened his eyes and purred, as if he understood every word. But inside me, something told me the story wasn't over yet. There was a mystery behind that look. Something I didn't understand. Why did he seem so different? Why did he look at the destroyed house as if he expected something, or someone, to emerge from it? The answer would come soon, but when it did, it changed everything I believed about miracles. The next day began with a silence that didn't seem real. No birds, no dogs, no sound of passing cars. Only the distant hum of sirens, echoing among the wreckage. I was sitting on the sidewalk, holding Lucky in my lap, still covered in dust. John walked around, trying to understand what remained of our house. And it was there, in that instant, that I realized, Fresno as we knew it was no more. The sun had barely risen, but the air already had a heavy metallic smell, as if the earth itself were still bleeding. The street where we had lived for decades was unrecognizable. Entire houses had been split in two, trees uprooted, and broken windows reflected fragments of sky. A magnitude 7.0 earthquake had struck us, and everything solid now seemed made of glass. John walked slowly, trying to find what was left of the balcony. Lucky stared at me, as if she could still hear sounds we couldn't. And I, even exhausted, felt that something wasn't over yet. It was as if the ground was breathing, alive, restless. Smaller aftershocks came and went, short tremors that made my heart race. Some neighbors approached. Mrs. Helen, from the house next door, was crying with her hands covering her face. "Margaret, are you all right? I thought everyone was." She stopped before finishing the sentence. I just shook my head, unable to answer. Her gaze fell on Lucky. "It was him, wasn't it? The cat. He woke you up." I nodded. She started crying harder. That scene broke me. There was something profoundly human in the collective despair. People hugging each other, searching for relatives, calling out names that faded into the air. A man knelt in the street holding a portrait of a little girl, and behind him, smoke rose from what used to be a bakery. Everything smelled of dust and fear. John returned, his gaze lost. "The room's gone, Margie. It's completely collapsed." He tried to smile, but his voice failed him. Lucky purred softly, nuzzling his nose against my hand. In that simple gesture, I felt more comfort than in any words. It was as if the cat was saying, "I warned you, and I'm still here." The following hours were a mixture of confusion and survival. Helicopters flew over the city. Volunteers shouted names, trying to organize the rescues. Some neighbors improvised tents with sheets, and the streets became makeshift shelters. I walked among the rubble as one walks amidst broken memories. Each step was a memory, The porch swing, the dining table, the photos on the wall. Everything was now dust. But within that chaos, something in me began to change. I didn't just feel fear, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for being alive. Gratitude for having listened to the signs, even without understanding them. Gratitude for that little being who woke me when the world was still asleep. When the firefighters arrived, they began marking off the ruined houses. Red zone, they said, marking the walls that were still standing with red paint. John tried to save some things, but I only wanted to save Lucky. And he, curious and calm, seemed to know where to step, avoiding the dangerous spots with almost supernatural precision. One of the rescuers approached and asked if we needed medical attention. I declined, but he insisted. "Ma'am, you were lucky. Most weren't." He said it in such a heavy voice that my stomach churned. Behind him, bodies were covered with white sheets. I closed my eyes and held Lucky against my chest. "It was God," I whispered. "It was God who gave us time." Late in the morning, a volunteer's portable radio began broadcasting the news. Epicenter located 30 miles from Fresno. Magnitude 7.0. Several neighborhoods in structural collapse. Unstable communications. Authorities ask for calm. But how can you stay calm when everything you know has been swallowed by the earth? John found a bottle of water and handed it to me. "Drink some, Margie." I accepted, but my hands were trembling. Lucky drank too, licking drops from my wrist. It was a small, almost symbolic gesture, but it made me realize something. Even amidst the chaos, life insisted on going on. Afternoon fell, and with it came the cold. Bonfires were lit in the streets, and people gathered around them, sharing blankets and stories. Someone began to pray aloud. Others joined in. The sound of prayers mingled with the crackling of the fire and the distant roar of helicopters. I closed my eyes and prayed, "Lord, do not abandon us now." When I opened my eyes, I realized Lucky had disappeared again. I looked around, my heart racing. "John, have you seen Lucky?" He looked around, shaking his head. "He was here a little while ago." I started calling him, walking through the crowd, my voice trembling. Nothing. No sound. No meow. That's when I heard something. A faint, muffled sound coming from near the ruins of our house. I ran over there, stumbling over the stones. John came after me, yelling for me to be careful. I knelt down and started removing pieces of wood and brick. "Lucky!" I called, my voice almost fading. Suddenly, a small sound answered. A meow. Faint, but clear. I kept digging, desperate. And that's when I found something I'll never forget. Lucky wasn't alone. Beside him was a little girl. She must have been about 6 years old, covered in dust, but alive. Lucky was lying on top of her, as if protecting her. My heart stopped for a second. "My God!" I whispered. John approached and stood motionless, shocked. We called the paramedics, who came running. When they took the girl away, she slowly opened her eyes and murmured something that gave me chills. "The kitten stayed with me the whole time." I cried. Lucky looked at me and then at the girl, with that old look, full of wisdom. That moment changed everything. He wasn't just a cat that sensed the earthquake. He was a life saving another. Lucky didn't just wake us up. He saved a child we didn't even know. And it was there, kneeling amidst the dust and tears, that I realized we were witnessing a real, tangible miracle, impossible to deny. The girl was taken away by the rescuers, and I stayed there, holding Lucky in my arms. The sun was beginning to set, tinging the wreckage orange. And while the world around us tried to understand the tragedy, I could only think of one thing. What else did Lucky know that we didn't already know? John put his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Maybe God hasn't finished what he started yet, Margie." And in that instant, looking at the shattered horizon, I knew he was right. Because the earth was still trembling, and something inside me told me that the real miracle was only just beginning. When the second tremor began, I was still holding Lucky in my lap. The ground vibrated with such force that the water bottle rolled and shattered against the curb. The sound was deafening, deep, as if the planet itself were groaning. People started screaming and running in all directions. John pulled me by the arm, shouting my name, but the panic was so great that his voice sounded distant. The earth shifted beneath our feet in waves. It was like trying to run on water. Each step felt like a struggle against something invisible. Lucky squirmed in my arms, trying to escape, and that's when I realized he wanted to guide me again. I let go of him, and he darted toward the street, pausing for a moment and looking back as if to say, "Come now." We ran. Dust rose in thick clouds, obscuring the sun. The noise of collapsing buildings mingled with cries, the sound of sirens, and prayers shouted amidst the rubble. The entire city seemed to groan along with the earth. I saw falling lampposts, snapping power lines, and blue sparks streaking across the air like lightning. John nudged me gently, trying to keep me upright. "Margie, keep walking. Don't stop." I felt the ground crack, small fissures opening beneath my feet. Lucky ran ahead, dodging the rubble, and I followed him as if that small gray body were the only compass left in the world. A gigantic crack sounded behind us. I turned my head, and saw what remained of the Henderson house splitting in two. A car was swallowed by a crack that opened in the asphalt. I screamed, not knowing if from fear or disbelief. The smell of gas began to spread. John noticed it too and shouted, "Margie, get to the avenue. Run." I wasn't thinking. I was just running. Lucky stopped at the corner, meowing loudly, and then disappeared behind a pile of rubble. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. "Lucky!" I called, my voice hoarse. John held me tight. "Don't come back, Margie. For God's sake." But I couldn't leave him behind. The fear of the land was less than the fear of losing him. Between the cracking and the dust, I could see him again. He was near a wall about to collapse. I ran to him, ignoring John's cries. The moment I caught him in my arms, the wall crumbled, just inches from us. The force of the impact threw me to the ground. I tasted blood in my mouth, but Lucky was alive, and that was all that mattered. John came running, coughing, trying to lift me up. "Are you okay?" I could barely answer. I just looked at him and then at the cat. Lucky was trembling, but still looking at me with that same look, intense, aware, almost human. It was he who, once again, saved our lives for seconds. We continued stumbling down the street. Neighbors huddled together in small groups, trying to help each other. Children cried, elderly people were carried in arms. A man shouted his wife's name from among the rubble. I couldn't see where the dust ended and the sky began. Everything was a blur. A new tremor shook the ground. This time, the noise was accompanied by a deeper crack, like the sound of subterranean thunder. Lucky jumped off my lap and started running again, this time towards the church on the corner. I hesitated for a second, but followed him. John came right behind, holding my hand tightly. When we arrived in front of the church, we saw that the iron gate was still standing. We ran inside, along with dozens of people seeking shelter. Inside, the floor shook, but the walls held firm. A priest prayed aloud, and people knelt on the floor, crying, pleading. I knelt too, still holding Lucky in my arms. "Lord, have mercy on us," I whispered. The words came out broken by fear. The ceiling creaked, pieces of plaster fell, but no one left. Everyone held each other's hands. And in the midst of that chorus of despair, Lucky let out a short, firm meow, as if he were praying with us. The ground shook again, this time with such force that the altar cracked. The candles fell, and one rolled to near a curtain. The fire began to rise slowly, gaining strength. John ran and ripped the fabric away before the fire spread. "Not yet, God, not yet," he murmured breathlessly. The lights were flickering. Outside, the sirens were getting louder. Lucky started to get agitated again, scratching the ground, trying to run outside. I held him, but he meowed loudly, desperately. That's when I realized he didn't want to run away. He wanted us to get out of there. Something worse was coming. "John, I think we need to leave now." He looked at me, his face pale. "Again? Where do you want to go?" Before I could answer, a deafening noise echoed outside. The bell in the tower began to ring, emitting a metallic, somber sound. The structure swayed dangerously. The church ceiling began to crack. "Everyone out!" shouted the priest. People started running, pushing each other, trying to escape. John pulled me, and we ran along with the crowd. Lucky shot ahead, disappearing in the dust. The sound of the bell striking out of rhythm echoed like a giant, desperate heart. The moment we stepped out the door, we heard the final crash, the church tower collapsing behind us. Dust engulfed us. I fell to my knees, coughing, my face covered in tears and soot. John hugged me. Lucky appeared seconds later, unharmed, covered in ash, looking at us as if to confirm, "You got out in time." And it was there, amidst the destruction, that I realized something deeper. That cat wasn't just saving our lives. It seemed to be guiding them. As if it saw what we couldn't see. As if it heard the voice of God echoing amidst the tremors of the earth. I looked at John, exhausted, and said, "Maybe all this isn't just luck, John. Maybe it's purpose." He didn't answer. He just looked at the smoke-filled sky. And in that moment, amidst the aftershocks that still made the ground tremble, I was certain that something bigger was about to be revealed. Lucky, sitting beside me, stared intently at the horizon. His gaze wasn't one of fear, it was one of expectation. And I knew, deep down, that he hadn't finished his mission yet. When the last tremor subsided, the world seemed to hold its breath. No sound, no movement. Only the distant echo of the chaos that, minutes before, had swallowed everything. The air was heavy, covered by a thick fog of dust. I couldn't tell if it was day or night. The sky had turned into a gray blanket. And in the midst of this silence, Lucky lay down beside me, exhausted. The city, once so vibrant, now seemed a desert of memories. I walked a few steps, still dazed, my heart pounding erratically. Each ruin I saw was an interrupted story. The broken swing of the neighbor's house, the overturned car on the corner, the fallen church bell. Everything seemed to have aged 100 years in a few seconds. John was still holding my hand, but I could feel the tremor in his fingers. He looked around, trying to recognize the neighborhood we grew up loving. "My God, Margie, it looks like the end of the world." I took a deep breath and replied, "Maybe it's a new beginning, John. Sometimes God destroys what is old to show us what can still be born." The wind began to blow slowly, scattering the dust and revealing what had previously been hidden. Lucky stood up and walked slowly to what remained of our house. I followed him, feeling the fine sand cling to my sweaty skin. The ground creaked beneath my feet, and every sound made my whole body tremble. When I got close to the garden, I recognized the crushed flowers, the broken vase, the overturned rocking chair. Everything seemed still, dead. But then, something caught my attention. Among the rubble, a small white flower was still standing. The only survivor. I knelt down and touched it carefully. Lucky approached and lay down beside it, as if he too recognized the sign. I cried. Not from sadness, but from astonishment. It was as if God were telling me, there is still life, even in the dust. And in that instant, pain and gratitude mingled in a way that human words cannot express. John hugged me from behind, without saying anything. We stood there, the three of us, me, him, and the cat, looking at that fragile flower that had resisted the end. The following hours dragged on. Helicopters flew over the city again, and fire trucks were scattered throughout the streets. People walked in silence, carrying what they could, a portrait, a suitcase, a piece of hope. Lucky followed my every step, attentive, like a silent guardian. From time to time, the aftershocks would return. Light tremors, almost subtle, but enough to remind us that the earth had not yet rested. At those times, Lucky would shrink back, his fur standing on end, and his eyes would be fixed on the ground. He seemed to hear the earth breathing. And every time he did that, I prayed, "Father, keep us under your wings. Don't let fear blind us." The prayer came out weak, but sincere. John nodded, and together we closed our eyes for a few seconds, trying to find strength in what cannot be seen. Because when everything collapses, it is only faith that still holds on. As evening fell, the dust began to settle. The sun appeared between the clouds, painting the sky with a golden and melancholic hue. Fresno, covered in ash, seemed to glow for an instant, a strange, almost sacred glow. Lucky gazed at the horizon, and I swear I saw in his eyes a reflection of light that didn't come from the sun. People began to gather near the old school. They set up tents, brought blankets, and shared food. Each person had a story to tell, and they all began the same way, If I hadn't woken up, it was as if something invisible had warned the entire city, each person in a different way. A woman named Ruth said her dog started barking hours before the earthquake and refused to stop. A man said he heard a sound coming from underground, like a buzzing. Another said he felt the ground vibrate for a second, but thought it was his imagination. Everyone had somehow received a warning. As I listened to these stories, I looked at Lucky and felt a shiver run down my spine. How many signs does God send us that we ignore? How many times is a simple gesture, a look, a sound heaven itself trying to wake us up? Perhaps Lucky was just a messenger, a channel for something greater that I didn't understand. John was dozing beside me, exhausted. I stroked Lucky's fur and closed my eyes for a moment. The sound of the voices around us faded into the distance. I felt my body relax for the first time in days. But then, a strange noise startled me, a metallic sound, like something falling. I opened my eyes and saw Lucky standing there, ears perked, looking into the wreckage. His fur stood on end. He began to walk slowly, sniffing the air, and then ran toward the sound. I jumped up. "Lucky, come back here." But he didn't hear me. I ran after him, stumbling over the stones. When I got close to the spot, I realized the noise was coming from a half-open manhole cover. Lucky was standing there, meowing softly. The sound was coming from inside. I crouched down, looked carefully, and heard something. A muffled sound. A human moan. "John!" I shouted. He came running. Together, we struggled to lift the lid. Down below, a weak voice called for help. A man, covered in mud, looked at us with desperate eyes. "Please, there are more people here." Lucky looked at me, and in that look was the same certainty he had on the night of the earthquake. Without him, perhaps no one would have found those people. He had sniffed out life where the world only saw death. The rescue began immediately. Firefighters rushed in and quickly pulled out the man and 2 other survivors. All were injured, but alive. When the last one emerged, the sun had completely set, and the sky was filled with shades of orange and purple. It looked like a divine painting over the human ruins. A firefighter approached and said to me, "Ma'am, if it weren't for your cat, they wouldn't have survived the night." I couldn't answer. I just looked at Lucky, who sat there, cleaning his paws, serene as if nothing had happened. That night, while everyone slept in their makeshift tents, I stayed awake, watching him. Lucky slept peacefully, his body covered in dust, but his gaze light, at peace. I wondered if he knew what he was doing, or if it was simply the hand of God guiding a small creature to show us the value of life. The wind blew gently, and I felt a shiver. The earth was still, but not at peace. There was something in the air, a tension I couldn't name. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Lord, if there is still more to come, give me the courage to see." And as I spoke, Lucky opened his eyes again, as if he had heard my prayer. He stared at me, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, and in that look, I perceived the premonition of something even deeper, something I wasn't yet ready to understand. The dawn that day was unlike any other. The sky over Fresno was gray, but a soft light pierced through the clouds, as if heaven itself had decided to settle upon the devastated city. I woke before sunrise, hearing the distant sound of the rescuers' shovels and hammers. Lucky was still sleeping peacefully at my feet, as if he had finally found rest. John was sitting near the campfire, staring into nothingness. The smoke rose slowly, and the smell of stale coffee mingled with cement dust. He looked at me and said, in a voice I barely recognized, "Margie, I can still hear the sound of the earth." Me too. Sometimes it seemed as if the ground breathed, like a sleeping giant. We heard a shout from across the street. A group of volunteers had found something under a huge pile of rubble. We ran over there, with Lucky following close behind. People were forming a circle around the site, and a firefighter was shouting instructions. "Careful, it could still collapse. Pass the ropes." The pile was all that remained of a small Sunday school. The colors of the bricks still bore traces of blue and red paint. Lucky stopped suddenly, sniffing the air, and then began to meow loudly, desperately, as he had on the night of the earthquake. "What is it now, boy?" I asked, but he wouldn't look at me. He stared fixedly at the ground. Suddenly, he jumped onto a piece of concrete, scratching it forcefully. John tried to grab him, but he dodged. "Margie, get him off there, it's dangerous." But something inside me stopped me. "Wait, John, leave him alone." Lucky kept scratching, digging, insisting. The nearest firefighter looked at us and said, "There's something there." They grabbed shovels, but the cat wouldn't stop. He meowed, moved from side to side, indicating exactly where to dig. The firefighter began to remove the pieces of rubble more carefully. "There's room here," one of them shouted. The crowd recoiled, their breath caught in their lungs. Lucky climbed down slowly and sat down, watching, as if he knew what was coming. Those minutes felt like hours. The noise of the shovels stopped. The firefighter put his hand in a small hole and shouted, "There's someone alive!" The sound made us all burst into tears. Lucky meowed loudly, and I fell to my knees, my hands trembling. "My God!" I murmured, my heart racing. More men came running. The shovels moved faster now, but carefully. Suddenly, an arm appeared. Then, the dust-covered face of a woman. She was breathing. She was alive. The crowd began to applaud, crying, shouting. Some knelt. Others raised their hands to the sky. I could only look at Lucky. He walked closer, sniffing the air. The woman was carefully pulled out. Her eyes slowly opened, and the first thing she did was smile. My son is still in there," she cried. Lucky immediately turned and ran to the other side of the pile. The firefighter followed him, and seconds later shouted, "There's someone else!" My whole body shivered. Lucky began digging frantically with his paws. The firefighter gently pushed him away and continued the work. When they finally removed the last pieces of concrete, a sound echoed, the faint cry of a child. A little boy, no more than 3 years old, was pulled out. The mother, still lying on a stretcher, raised her arms. "My baby!" she cried, and the sound of her voice pierced everything, the dust, the fear, the time. Everyone was crying. Even John, who had always been so reserved, let the tears flow freely. And Lucky, among them all, just stood there, watching, his eyes brimming with tears. One of the firefighters came up to me and said, "Ma'am, this cat has an incredible sense of smell. Without him, we would never have found these people." I didn't know what to say. I just touched Lucky's head, and he snuggled into my lap. "It's not a sense of smell," I whispered. "It's faith." As the paramedics carried the mother and child away, the sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the exact spot where they had been rescued. It was a pure, golden light, almost impossible to look directly at. People fell silent, some began to pray, others simply gazed in contemplation. I approached the spot and noticed something that made my heart race. Among the bricks and dust, a small wooden cross was still intact. It must have fallen from the school wall, but it remained standing, embedded in the earth, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. I picked it up in my hands and felt a gentle warmth. "John, look at this," I said, pointing to the cross. He looked at it, his eyes welling up with tears. "Margie, it looks like a sign." I smiled weakly. "It doesn't look like one, John." "It is." Lucky purred softly, and in that sound there was more faith than in any sermon. The woman and her son were taken to the field hospital, and everyone returned to their seats. But no one spoke for several minutes. There was something sacred in that silence. People looked at Lucky with a new kind of respect. He was no longer the cat that saved the neighbors. He was something more. John put his arm around my shoulders and said, "You realize, Margie? Every time he meows, a life is saved." And I knew it was true. Lucky wasn't just an animal instinct. He was like an open channel between heaven and earth. News of the rescue spread quickly. A reporter arrived and started filming. People recounted, emotionally, what they had seen. I spoke with a choked voice. "It was him. It was Lucky who found him. I just followed what he showed me." The reporter lowered the camera for a moment and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Maybe this cat heard God first, ma'am." At night, the temperature dropped. Bonfires lit up the streets again, and the sound of prayers spread once more. I held the small cross I found among the rubble and gazed at the sky. Each star seemed more alive, as if the whole city were praying silently. Lucky slept beside me, exhausted, his body curled up and his snout resting on his paws. But while the world slept, a distant sound echoed again, a deep thunderclap from the east. John opened his eyes and looked at me worriedly. "Did you hear that, Margie?" I nodded, and Lucky lifted his head, ears perked up. He looked at the horizon and let out a low, tense meow. The following silence was absolute. Only the wind. Only the premonition. That same old shiver that precedes the twists of fate. I stroked his fur and whispered, "What is it now, boy? It's not over yet, is it?" Lucky stared at me, her eyes reflecting the glow of the bonfire flames. And in that look, I knew, the next miracle was still on its way. In the days following the earthquake, Fresno seemed like a place between two worlds, half ruin, half rebirth. The destruction was still everywhere, but something new was beginning to sprout from the rubble: faith. Every corner held a story of survival, every face bore the mark of gratitude. The silence of before had been replaced by voices, prayers, and the comforting sound of reconstruction. Rescue teams now mingled with volunteers from other cities. Young people distributed food, churches set up shelters, and the streets began to fill with life. It was strange to think that, amidst so much suffering, I saw more humanity than at any other time in my life. Lucky walked among the people, almost like a symbol. Children approached to pet him, and he patiently accepted. He seemed to know he was loved. A group of firefighters even improvised a small red collar for him, with a tag that read, "The Miracle Cat." When I saw that, my eyes filled with tears. He purred serenely, as if he understood the tribute. John was helping to erect one of the larger tents in the center of town. Sweat dripped down his face, but his gaze was different. There was peace. "You know, Margie," he said, "sometimes God needs to shake the ground so we remember where the true foundation lies." I smiled, clutching the wooden cross I still carried in my pocket. "And that foundation was never concrete, John. It was always faith." At night, people gathered around the bonfires. The flames flickered like hearts beating in the dark. Someone began to softly sing an ancient hymn, "Amazing Grace," and soon everyone joined in. Voices mingled with tears and smiles. I sang too, with Lucky lying in my lap. And when I looked at the sky, I realized something. The stars had never shone so brightly. The days were long, but they no longer weighed as heavily as before. Fear gave way to hope. I helped in the communal kitchen, preparing soups and distributing bread. Each dish served was a small act of love. Lucky was always nearby, sitting beside the table, observing everything with that silent gaze that seemed to bless the place. Sometimes he would get up and walk over to someone who was crying, resting his head on the person's knee. It was impossible not to be moved. One day an elderly lady hugged him and said, "God sent you to remind us that there is still tenderness in the world." Lucky just purred. And in that soft sound, we all felt a little healing. The news began to tell our stories. Cameras filmed the prayers, the rescues, and, of course, Lucky. In a short time, the whole country knew about the cat that predicted the earthquake. Reporters came from far and wide just to film him sleeping. I found it all surreal, but also beautiful. It was as if the tragedy had given the world a lesson no one expected. John laughed at it all. "Look, Margie, we lived to see our cat become a celebrity." I laughed too, but deep down I felt something more profound: pride. Pride in seeing love in the form of gray fur and golden eyes being recognized for its mission. Lucky didn't speak, but he said everything without needing words. The children at the shelter started drawing him. In many drawings, he appeared with white wings. When I asked a little girl why she had drawn him like that, she replied, "Because he's the angel who saved Mommy." She was the daughter of the woman he had found under the rubble. I hugged the girl and cried. The following days brought a new calm. The ground stopped shaking, and people began to clean, rebuild, and plant. John and I managed to set up a small tent near the old house, using planks and tarps. Lucky slept in the corner, wrapped in a red blanket. Sometimes I watched him sleep and thought, how many times does God protect us without us even realizing it? The volunteers began calling the shelter Hope Field. It was there that the entire neighborhood gathered to share food, stories, and faith. A pastor from another city came and organized a Thanksgiving ceremony. The makeshift altar was a simple table covered with a white sheet. Lucky, of course, sat beside it. The pastor spoke about angels who walk among us. He said that sometimes they don't have wings, they have paws. And when he said that, everyone looked at Lucky, who seemed to understand every word. He stood up, walked over to the pastor, and lay down at the foot of the table. The man smiled and said, "Here is the sign of grace that still protects us." I will never forget that moment. The sun was setting behind the ruins, tinging everything with gold. People were crying, hugging, praying. Lucky stayed there until the end, motionless, like a sentinel of faith. And in that instant, I knew, something inside all of us had been reborn. But even amidst the peace, there was a mystery that troubled me. At night, when everything was silent, Lucky would get up and walk alone to the spot where our old house used to be. He would stand there, staring into nothingness, for long minutes. He seemed to be waiting for someone. One night, I decided to follow him. The wind was cold, and the distant sound of the generators cast a melancholy air. Lucky sat down in front of the empty lot and looked at the moon. I stood beside him, unsure what to say. "You still feel something, don't you?" I asked softly. He blinked slowly, as if to confirm it. Suddenly, he looked back and meowed, as if asking me to pay attention. On the ground, between the stones, there was a small mark. It looked like the outline of a paw, but it was bigger, deeper, almost etched into the earth. I touched it with my fingers and felt a slight warmth. A shiver ran through my body. "John!" I called, but he was already asleep. I stood there, staring at that mysterious mark, until the wind blew strongly and stirred up dust. When the dust settled, the mark had disappeared. Lucky got up, took one last look, and walked back to the shelter. I followed him, my heart racing. That night was long. I dreamt of a field of light, full of white cats, all looking at me with golden eyes. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. Lucky was at my feet, watching me intently. He rested his head on my leg, and the fear passed. In the following days, I continued to feel a strange energy in the air. Fresno was coming back to life, but there was something invisible watching us, a good, protective presence. Lucky seemed to feel it too. Sometimes he would stare into space and wag his tail slowly, as if to say, "There's still something to come." And he was right. Because a week later, when the world already believed the worst was over, the third twist in our story happened. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared us for what we would see that day. That morning, the sun rose in a strange way, more orange than usual, almost reddish, as if the sky held a secret. The air was too calm, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. John and I were packing up the boxes at the shelter, helping the neighbors who were returning to their rebuilt homes. It felt like the beginning of a new era. Lucky, however, wasn't around. I noticed his absence as soon as I woke up. The red blanket where he slept was cold, and his paws hadn't left any tracks in the fine dust around him. I felt a pang in my chest. "John, have you seen Lucky?" He looked around, distracted. "He must be hunting, Margie. Cats are like that." But something inside me said no. I waited. I called. I walked through the shelter, the alleys, and the surrounding ruins. No sign of him. The children also searched for him, shouting his name, like someone calling a dear friend. But the afternoon faded, and Lucky didn't return. Unease grew inside me like a shadow. That night was the longest since the earthquake. Lying on the small makeshift mattress, I listened to the distant sound of the wind rustling through the tents. Each whistle seemed like a voice. I closed my eyes and prayed. "Lord, he's just a cat, but he was the instrument of your will. If it is your will, bring him back." And before sleep overtook me, I swear I heard a soft, distant meow coming from the east. The next morning, the volunteers were excited. Fresno was truly beginning to be reborn. But inside, there was an emptiness. I spent the day helping to distribute blankets, but my heart was elsewhere. In the afternoon, I sat near the ruins of the old church and began to write in my notebook, something between a prayer and a farewell letter. As I was writing, a little girl approached. It was the daughter of the woman Lucky had saved. She held a flower in her hand. "Aunt Margie," she said, "Mom asked me to give you this." She said it's for the kitten's angel. I took the flower, a white daisy, and smelled its light fragrance. Thank you, dear. She smiled and ran off. But before disappearing, she turned and said, He'll be back. Those words kept echoing in my head. He'll be back. I stood there for hours, watching the horizon, as if waiting for a sign. The wind blew, raising a light mist of dust. I closed my eyes for a second, and when I opened them, I swear I saw something moving in the distance. A small figure walked along the road, amidst the rubble and golden dust of the twilight. At first, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. But as the shape drew closer, my heart began to race. John, who was stacking boxes, also stopped and looked. Margie, is that him? And it was. Lucky was walking slowly, covered in dust, limping slightly, but with the same serene look as always. People started shouting, pointing, and soon a crowd formed. Someone said, It's the Miracle Cat. Lucky kept walking until he stopped right in front of me. I knelt down, unable to hold back the tears. My love, where were you? He approached slowly, rubbed his muzzle against my hand, and purred. There was something different about him, something I couldn't explain. His fur seemed lighter, almost silvery, and there was a new collar around his neck. A collar I had never seen before. Made of dark leather, simple, but with a small gold plate engraved with a single word, Grace. Grace. I felt a shiver run through my whole body. John approached, incredulous. Margie, you put that on him? I shook my head. No. I've never seen that collar in my life. People crowded around. Everyone wanted to touch him, to see what he was wearing around his neck. Lucky just lay there, serene, as if he were at home. A firefighter looked closely and said, Who would have done this? No animal shelters around here are open. No one answered. The silence that followed was almost sacred. That night, the story spread. The Miracle Cat is back, the volunteers exclaimed. The pastor came over to us and wanted to see the collar. When he read the word Grace, he smiled and said, Sometimes God sends angels with simple names so that we don't confuse them with the great miracles. Because grace doesn't shout, it whispers. I stayed awake, watching Lucky sleep beside me. The moon reflected off the golden metal of the nameplate, casting small beams of light across the tent. I couldn't stop looking. Grace, I murmured. Is that the name heaven gave him? Lucky stirred slightly, and for a moment, I swear I saw something gleam in his eyes, a light not of this world. In the following days, his behavior changed. He spent more time looking up, especially at dusk. Sometimes he would disappear for hours and then return, clean and fragrant, as if someone had taken care of him. John said it was my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. Lucky had changed, and with him, the air around us had changed too. One day, upon waking, I found something on the blanket where he slept, a small white ribbon, tied in a bough. I asked everyone at the shelter, but no one knew where it came from. I picked up the ribbon and held it between my fingers. It was soft, it smelled of jasmine, the same perfume my mother used when I was a child. That broke me. I felt the tears fall without warning. Sir, what's happening? Lucky came closer, rubbed his nose against my hand, and then looked up at the sky. The wind blew strongly, shaking the tents. And for a moment, the sound of the wind seemed like a whisper, Remember the promise. I spent the rest of the day in silence, reflecting. A promise. Whose? God's? Lucky's? Or both? That night, I returned to the site of the old house. The moon was full, and everything seemed clearer. Lucky followed me, walking side by side, unhurried. When we reached the center of the plot, he stopped and looked at me. I stood there, motionless, waiting. He began to lightly dig the ground with his paws, and soon a small metal box emerged from among the clods of earth. What's this, Lucky? I asked, my heart racing. I picked up the box, cleaned it, and saw that it had a symbol engraved on it, a cross with wings. I opened it slowly. Inside was an old photograph, me, John, and Lucky, taken months before, with the house still intact. But on the back of the photo, there was something handwritten, Grace always returns when love is true. The tears simply fell. John, who was arriving behind me, stopped, confused. "Margie, what is this?" he asked, breathless. I handed him the photo. Lucky sat between us, staring intently. And at that moment, the wind stopped. The air became still, silent. I knew it was more than a coincidence. It was a message. I knelt down, hugged Lucky, and cried, "Thank you, God, for reminding me that your love returns, even when all seems lost." John hugged me too, and the three of us stayed there, amidst the dust illuminated by the moon. But before the emotion could turn into peace, something happened. Lucky slowly walked away, stepping into the middle of the street. He stopped, looked back, and stared at me for a few seconds. And then, a flash crossed the sky, an intense, silent white light that illuminated the entire city. People began to emerge from their tents, frightened, pointing to the sky. "What is that?" someone shouted. And I, my heart racing, saw Lucky in the middle of that light, motionless, looking at me serenely. The light pulsed once more, and for a brief second, time seemed to stand still. And that's when I realized, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something even greater, something the world would never forget. That light in the sky remained for long seconds, white and silent, as if time itself had forgotten to pass. Everyone in Fresno stopped. No one spoke, no one moved. Lucky, standing in the middle of the street, looked at me, motionless, his eyes reflecting the brilliance of that divine light. It was as if the whole world was witnessing a miracle unfold before their eyes. The wind blew strongly, raising dust and sparks from the bonfires. The light began to pulse slowly, and within it, I swear I saw something. A silhouette. Small, delicate, with wings that seemed made of pure light. For a moment, I was certain, it wasn't just an illusion, it was a presence. John, beside me, held my hand tightly. "Margie, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" I couldn't answer. Tears were already streaming down my face. Lucky stepped forward fearlessly, head held high, and meowed, a sweet, soft, almost human sound. The echo of that meow pierced the air and seemed to calm everything around. The screams ceased, the sirens fell silent, and the earth, for the first time in days, was completely still. The light began to dim, but didn't disappear. It slowly receded until it was concentrated directly above Lucky. And then, like a whisper, something shimmered around him. It was as if tiny golden particles were falling from the sky, landing on his fur. I knelt down, unable to look away. "Sir, what are we witnessing?" Lucky turned his face and looked at me one last time. That look, there was something there that surpassed what I could comprehend. It wasn't the look of a cat. It was the look of a soul that knew more than any human being. It was at that moment that he took a step forward, and the light enveloped him completely. The light was so intense I had to cover my eyes. When the glare faded, Lucky was no longer there. People began to murmur, frightened. "Where did he go? Did you see? He's gone." John stood motionless, silent, his gaze fixed on the spot where Lucky had been seconds before. I ran to the spot, my heart racing. There was only dust, and something on the ground. I knelt down and found the collar, the same one, with the gold tag. Only now, instead of grace, there was a new word engraved on it, faith. Faith. Tears blinded me. I clutched the leash to my chest, unable to speak. The pastor approached slowly and knelt beside me. "Margie," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "there are things God reveals only to those who truly believe. Perhaps this little messenger fulfilled his purpose." I looked at him, trying to understand. "Do you think he was an angel?" The pastor smiled slightly. "I think he was love. And love is the purest form of miracle." People began to hug each other, some crying, others laughing, as if witnessing something sacred. John stood up, taking a deep breath. "Margie, maybe the cat was never just a cat." I nodded, wiping away tears. "I think he was always God reminding me that he is here, even in the little things." That night, no one slept. The shelter became an altar of candles, and everyone wanted to pray. Children left drawings of Lucky on the tables, and adults silently lit candles. The entire city seemed united by a single feeling, gratitude. The tragedy had been transformed into a testament. The next morning, the sun rose brighter, gilding the horizon. The smell of damp earth mingled with the distant sound of hammers rebuilding houses. I walked slowly down the street, leash in hand, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. And then I noticed something new. In the spot where Lucky had disappeared, a small white flower was growing between the cracks in the asphalt. I knelt down and touched it. The same kind of flower I had found in the garden days after the earthquake. I smiled through tears. "You've come back again, haven't you?" I whispered. John came closer and put his hand on my shoulder. "Margie, do you think he—" I interrupted him, looking at the sky. "I don't think so, John. I believe so." That was the day Fresno truly was reborn. People began to rebuild, but now with something new in their hearts, a living, palpable faith, fueled by a small, four-legged miracle. Lucky's stories spread throughout the country. Churches quoted his name in sermons. Children drew his face in art class. But the real miracle wasn't the earthquake prediction, nor the rescues. The miracle was what happened within us, the awakening. Lucky had shown us that God's love can come in the most unexpected forms. That sometimes, heaven uses what is small to remind the world of what is eternal. Weeks later, I went to the hospital where the woman and boy saved by Lucky were. She hugged me tightly. "I dreamed about him," she said, crying. "He was surrounded by light, and he told me that life is the most beautiful gift God gives us." We stayed there, the two of us, crying and laughing at the same time. Back in the rebuilt house, I kept the collar on the table, next to the wooden cross I found among the debris. Sometimes the wind would come in through the window and make the two touch, producing a soft, almost musical sound. It was as if he were still there, playing with the air. One afternoon, while sewing a new curtain, I heard a familiar sound, the faint metallic clinking I would recognize anywhere. I looked around, my heart racing. The house was empty. But then the wind blew again, and the clinking returned, coming from the porch. I ran over there, and what I saw made time stand still. On the rocking chair, a small tuft of gray fur, caught between the wooden slats. I touched it slowly, and a gentle breeze brushed against my face. I smelled the scent I knew so well, jasmine and damp earth. Tears fell on their own. "Welcome back, my angel." John appeared at the door and saw me smiling. "Margie, are you all right?" I just nodded, without looking at him. "Yes, John." He never left. And at that moment, the clock we had rescued from the rubble started working again, marking the correct time, 3 o'clock in the morning. The same time it all began. I looked at the sky one last time that night. The stars shone brighter than ever, and among them, one seemed to twinkle in a different way, rhythmic, almost playful. I smiled. "Good night, Lucky." But before I could go inside, the wind blew once more, and a soft, almost imperceptible voice echoed within me, "Love doesn't leave. It just changes shape." And so, I understood the mystery. Lucky had never left. He simply returned to where love never dies, the hearts of those who believe. If there's one thing I've learned from everything I've experienced, it's that God speaks to us all the time. We just need to learn to listen. Sometimes he uses silence. Sometimes a stranger. And every now and then, he uses a little gray cat to change the course of an entire life. Lucky wasn't just a pet. He was a living reminder that God's love is real, and that miracles still happen, even when the world crumbles around us. Today, every time the wind blows at night, I feel him nearby. Not in the way it used to be, but in a lighter, more eternal way. And every time I see a flower bloom among the stones, I remember what that little being taught me, that grace can return, that faith can flourish, and that nothing is too small to be used by God. Perhaps you, who are listening to this story, have already felt something similar, a presence, a sign, a whisper in your heart telling you to keep believing, even when everything seems lost. And if you felt it, don't ignore it. It could be your own Lucky, your angel in the form of a gesture, reminding you that God has never abandoned you. Life is made of earthquakes. Some shake the earth, others the heart. But there is always something that endures. And that something is love. And now I ask you, have you ever felt that something, or someone, protected you at a time when nothing made sense? Have you ever experienced a miracle so subtle that you only realized later it was God at work? Write in the comments what your heart has experienced. Your story may be the comfort someone else needs to hear today. Before I go, I want to thank you for being with me this far. I ask God to bless your life with health, peace, and faith. May He envelop you with the same love that once saved me through a simple cat named Lucky. And if this story touched your heart, I invite you, with much affection, to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, so you can continue receiving messages that warm the soul. Because, in the end, the world is constantly changing. But God's love, that never changes.